Well, good evening, everyone. Buenas noches. Okay, well, so how many of you here only speak English? You got a few, más o menos, okay. ¿Cuántos de ustedes solo hablan español y no entienden nada de inglés? Okay, a few of you, very good. So, Lucía me dice que están arreglando lo del sonido, entonces ya dentro de poco le hacen la traducción, okay. Well, thank you very much for your invitation. Bishop, so good to see you as well, and thank you for being with us, launching this series as well, this important class. And this reflection, thank you to everyone here at the College of Our Lady of Elms. Good, okay, so no, it seems like it's working well. Is everybody able to? Okay. Now can you hear me? Yes, they should be. Okay, good. So I'm going to share with you tonight a number of thoughts and reflections on the Hispanic Catholic spirituality, okay? And one of the goals of tonight is to provide a framework for other conversations that are gonna follow this one, and some of you will be eventually receiving a certificate for participating in this particular exercise. But the idea tonight is, again, providing a framework to understand, one, why Hispanic spirituality is important. Two, what are some of the core elements of Hispanic spirituality that we can actually take into consideration as we imagine ourselves building the church in the United States of America. So a little bit about myself. My name is Hosffman Ospino, and I am an associate professor of theology at Boston College School of Theology and Ministry. Boston College is one of these sui generis institutions that has more than 70 theologians, and
Boston College tiene un promedio de 70.
We're trying to figure this out well. Okay, that's all right.
Ya están haciendo los ajustes.
What about now?
Ahora.
One, two, three. One, two, three. Now, perfect. Okay, so Deacon, are you okay back there? Good. Well, technology is supposed to make our lives easier, isn't it? So it's just remember, as Catholics, we're people of hope. We're not going to give up on this. So that's it. Okay, so this is what we're going to be doing tonight. I'm going to walk you tonight. So I'm going to speak for about an hour or so. Okay. And I'm going to walk you through these five moments in this lecture presentation. One, we're going to begin to speak about the relationship between worship and culture, race, ethnicity. Two, we're going to look at two historical dynamics that took place around the Council of Trent that in many ways defined, how we worship in the entire American continent, and how those two trends and those two streams, as a matter of fact, are coinciding today in the United States of America, particularly in light of the work or in the presence of the Hispanic community. We're going to look at three moments of expressions of Hispanic life, Hispanic spiritual life. One, Hispanics in liturgical life. We're gonna spend a bit more time on Hispanics and popular Catholicism, and I'll explain why this much. And then finally, we're gonna take a quick look at ecclesial movements and how the ecclesial movements shape the experience of Hispanic Catholics in the United States, okay? So let's begin with the first step. Before we go into some of the practical dimensions of this, let me just share a few thoughts on the Hispanic community. If we were here in this lecture 70 years ago, most likely, most Catholics in this room would be white, Euro-American, English-speaking, and they would be the children and grandchildren and the descendants of immigrants who came from Europe, okay? By the 1960s or so, many of the so-called national parishes, meaning parishes that were established to serve the needs, and linguistic, cultural, religious, spiritual needs of immigrants from Europe, they were dwindling in terms of their number, but they also were actually shifting in terms of their goals and the religious experience that they were providing. So instead of serving only the Germans and only the French and only the Irish and only the Italians, so St. Mary's Parish technically became St. Mary's Parish. So it wasn't the German parish any longer or the Irish parish any longer and so on, The parish where I worship, for instance, is called St. Patrick, and it was built by Catholic immigrants from Ireland, And my friends, the older friends remember hearing stories from their parents and grandparents who said, in this parish, we only welcome Irish people, okay? Because this church was built by the Irish for the Irish, By the 1960s, much of that had already subsided, okay? So now we begin to see a more settled Euro-American Catholic experience in the United States. And the Hispanic community actually numerically was much smaller, Most Hispanics in the United States of America back then were living mainly in California, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Southwest, a little bit of Southeast, and then in the big cities of the United States, Here in Massachusetts, for instance, the first Latinos that we see, the first large migration of Latinos that we see is Puerto Ricans, And we see Puerto Ricans early in the 20th century, mostly farm workers, okay? But by the middle of the 20th century, the presence of the Puerto Rican presence still small in Catholic churches, okay? Fast forward 70 years. As we look at Catholicism in the United States 70 years later, in the year 2022, well, those groups that were considered minoritized, that were considered underrepresented, or that were considered small communities, those groups are actually redefining Catholicism in the United States. I'll give you numbers. 70 years ago, about 90% of all Catholics in the United States of America were white Euro-American, English-speaking, mostly English-speaking. Today, that number is less than 50%, give or take. Hispanics 70 years ago were about 10% of the entire population in the United States. Today, Hispanics are about 43 to 45% of all Catholics. African Americans and African American Catholics, have remained, the number of Black Catholics has remained actually very steady over the years. The percentage has remained steady of the Catholic population, about 3.94%. The one difference is that 70 years ago, the vast majority of Black Catholics were African Americans, meaning these were Catholics who had, at some point, someone in their family experienced either segregation, slavery, or major discrimination, as we know throughout the history of the United States. What's interesting is that today, when you pull together all Black Catholics, only half are African Americans, and then the other half are immigrants from the Caribbean and from Africa, okay? So now we have a growing and a new Black Catholic experience in the United States. And what's most interesting is that the fastest growing group in the Catholic Church in this country is not Hispanics or white Catholics or Black Catholics. The fastest growing group is Asians, okay? So if you're struggling learning Spanish or learning some Creole, try some Vietnamese, or try some Chinese or Japanese, because I mean, that's actually what now we're beginning to see in many communities. So about 5% of all Catholics in the United States of America are Asian, okay? So we got a church of many cultures. We got a church of many cultures. So this church, in many ways, is a church of minorities, a church of or if you want to use, a church of cultural communities. Now, how do we worship in this community? We worship the same triune God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. We believe in the same scriptures. We read the same scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, the New Testament. We have the same 7 sacraments. We have the same faith. Nonetheless, because of our different cultural traditions, we can speak about a particular way in which Euro-American Catholics celebrate and live their faith. We can speak about a particular way in which African Americans celebrate and live their faith. We can speak about a particular way in which Hispanics celebrate and live our faith. And within each group, within each of these groups, as a matter of fact, there is also diversity. For instance, to say that white Catholics in New England celebrate and worship their faith in a somewhat different way compared to Catholics in California, okay? Or Catholics in the Northwest, if you are in Oregon, or if you are in Seattle, Washington State, and so on. Same thing with Latinos. Latinos, one thing is to be working in a Mexican community or a mostly Mexican community. Another one is to be working and celebrating the faith in a mostly Caribbean community, mainly Dominican or Cuban or Puerto Rican, okay? And within the Asian community, the same thing. It's not the same, how Vietnamese celebrate their Mass and celebrate their rituals compared to Filipinos, or compared to Chinese Catholics and so on. So, all of this just to tell you that, the last job that you would like to have in the Catholic Church at this very moment is bishop, Because the bishop, according to canon law, is the ultimate chief, liturgical chief in the diocese. So, the bishop and those who work in the diocese, with the pastors and pastoral associates, deacons, lay leaders, vowed religious, and volunteers, and everybody else, we all together need to sit down and figure out how do we develop beautiful liturgies? How do we imagine and cultivate the spirituality of these communities while, on the one hand, we are faithful to our tradition, but on the other, how do we honor the particularities of race, culture, language, and location? So this is where we're going to begin. So with that in mind, okay? So what we have here is ideally, in an ideal world, you know, worship brings the community together. Sacrosanctum Concilium, which is the constitution in the Second Vatican Council that speaks about the liturgy, you know, tells us that in the celebration of the liturgy, in the celebration particularly of the Eucharist, you know, we become who we are called to be, okay? So the Eucharist, the liturgy, pulls us together, brings us together. That is our theology. That's what we want, no? And in this ideal world, the liturgy brings us together. Doesn't matter if you are rich or poor, if you are immigrant or US born, if you are highly educated or you have little education. It doesn't matter if you speak English or Spanish. It doesn't matter if you belong to, you have a job in an office or you work in the fields. When we come to Mass, when we celebrate a wedding, when we receive the sacrament, everybody is the same. So in some ways, in principle, the liturgy, no, and particularly the Eucharist, is the best equalizer that we have in terms of the faith, you know, because to the eyes of God, we are all the same, and through the liturgy coming together, we all worship the same, the one and the same God. So in that ideal world, the worship community, no, the liturgy brings us together. It is the ultimate expression of what it means to be Christian, a Christian community. It integrates, delivers despite their differences. So now, the question is that in the United States of America, as we imagine ways of worshiping together, no, well, one thing is to have the theology in the back of our minds. Another one is to go to a parish that is bilingual or trilingual or multicultural, okay? Because that's where the rubber hits the road, you know? I mean, of course, we all agree with the fact that, yes, the liturgy brings us together, you know? But put together a Dominican, a Puerto Rican, and a Mexican to organize a Marian feast, okay? Or try to organize a bilingual Mass or a trilingual Mass, okay? So, for instance, I met a pastor one day who, you know, was assigned to a parish by his bishop, and the pastor went to visit the community. This community had 7 language communities. None of the 7 language communities, English. The pastor spoke English in none of the 7 languages in the community, okay? How do you pull together this community? So people are gonna try to play things here and there and so on. Well, let me tell you something. In 2014, I did a national study I conducted with a team from Boston College, a national study on Catholic parishes with Hispanic ministry, okay? And we surveyed about 4,300 parishes nationwide. We spoke to pastors and pastoral leaders, lay women, laymen. We spoke to deacons, and we got data, you know, in different ways. There was one thing that we discovered when it came to the liturgy, that nobody likes bilingual liturgies. People don't like, Catholics don't like multilingual liturgies for many reasons, okay? One, most people go to Mass and they want to understand everything, okay? In a bilingual Mass, unless you are bilingual, you will get what is said in English and what is said in Spanish, okay? So a lot of people get upset because they say, I don't understand what's going on the other half of the Mass. And then there are people who say, well, you know what? I am bilingual, and now I get twice the same Mass or the same service because the priest says it in English, and now they says it in Spanish, okay? And then there are people who say, I can't take the shifting from Vietnamese to Portuguese to Spanish. You know, let's do Latin, you know? So some people are saying, we should be doing Latin. So who has the right formula? We don't have a right formula. We gotta go into this by understanding the community. Well, there are models that people are trying to figure this out, to figure out. For instance, some people are trying to use the one-size-fits-all model, okay? Meaning, let's try to find the common denominator that will make everybody happy, okay? I'm still waiting for that, by the way, you know? It's just like, what's the common denominator that is gonna make, you know? For instance, you know, there are communities, I have seen communities that are mostly white Euro-American, and then the bishop assigns the parish to serve also the African-American community. And the white parishioners say, I just can't understand why they are so cheery and why they sing music like this and why they use these hymnals this way. And we don't understand the culture. But then sometimes we have in the Latino community, you know, you go to some masses and people clap, no? And a lot of people like clapping. Other people get upset because people are clapping, no? So in the one-size approach, no, or one-size-fits-all approach, everybody, the communities, has a quest. How do we find you know, something that in the liturgy that pleases everybody? The answer is, most likely you're not gonna find it. Most likely you're not gonna find it. Some people, some priests in some dioceses have shifted to celebrating the Mass in Latin, okay? And it's a beautiful Mass. And it's part of the diversity of the church. The downside of doing that is that Masses in Latin usually are celebrated or are appreciated by about 10% of the Catholic population. So almost everybody else would go somewhere else or would not go to Mass, okay? So the one-size approach, should we do it in Spanish? Should we do it bilingually? That was the big question. The other approach is the liturgical buffet, okay? Have you ever been to a Mass when they start the Mass in Spanish and everybody says, alabaré, alabaré, and everybody's singing Spanish, and then all of a sudden the priest switches to English, you know, in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. And then the next words are in Italian, you know, benvenuti, no, tutti. And then you miss, you start borrowing here. No, we do the Mass in English. The first reading in English, the second reading in Spanish, the third reading or the gospel, we might do it in Portuguese. So we turn the Mass and the celebration, the liturgical celebration, into a spiritual or liturgical buffet. Which of these options is better? The universalized, one-size-fits-all, or the liturgical buffet? The answer is none of the above, but both have a little bit of value. They both have a little bit of value. And in a multicultural church, that's one of the biggest challenges that we have. You know, how do we bring these communities together? Some concerns as we try to imagine the liturgy. One, that when we try to imagine worshiping in a community together, some of us are so concerned for unity, about unity, that we blur differences. We take away the languages, we take away the history, we take away, you know, how people have learned how to worship throughout their lives. Two, we also need to know that culture is much more complex than little samples of, you know, celebrations or rituals or external expressions. And also, worship leaders need to learn that, you know, we all have to learn how to celebrate in different ways, no? So the key here is not to imagine different gods or different spiritualities, but entering into the same worship through different lenses, And as we do that, you know, then we can start imagining, for instance, rather than focusing just only on the practices, and I know that most of us live in the world of the practical, what about if we were to begin? What about we were to begin by educating ourselves about the principles of spirituality in a culturally diverse world? One of them then is, what about if instead of trying to do the potpourri of many languages or of many symbols and so on, we were to have, first of all, a series of conversations about globalization and Catholicity, no? So we need to start raising awareness that the global, no, exists in the context of the local. In other words, in the context of the multicultural parish, we begin to see a community, the universality of the church, many languages, many faces, many experiences, many histories, many stories, they are all present in the same community. And by being aware about that, then we express our Catholicity. We start living into our Catholicity. How many of you here have ever been to the Holy Land? Bishop has been to the Holy Land. I have been to the Holy Land. How many of you have visited Rome? Okay, so, homework for everybody else. Plan a trip to the Holy Land, and after that, then plan a trip to Rome, okay? You've got to experience this. It's a beautiful experience. It is a beautiful experience. But it is in those big places, for instance, when we are at the St. Peter's Square, with the Pope, it's just fascinating to see people from all over the world, worshiping and singing and praying together, regardless of their differences. Because the key here is not what language gets imposed or what cultural practice is more important than the other, but an appreciation for this multicultural experience that we know that we all have, or to which we are all being exposed. Two, another possibility is that as we grow in community, we are all being exposed one another to different forms, of worship, and to appreciate the many ways in which God is experienced, okay? For some people, God is experienced in a physical way, holding hands, touching, hugging. For other people, God is expressed through singing. For other people, God is expressed through actually taking distance from one another. Silence, no? I remember, as an immigrant myself, I remember when I first came to the United States of America, I came from a culture in which when you are at Mass and at the time of peace, everybody hugs everybody, So I remember that I was actually, hugging everybody and so on. But when I came to the United States and I went to my first Mass only in English, at the time of peace, nobody hugged anybody, So I remember that people actually did this, they just kept the distance. And at first it was a little bit awkward to me, but eventually I learned, that for some cultures, keeping the space and maintaining certain space, is part of how you experience God, and that's how you worship, So sometimes we are overly critical of how people experience their faith, whether they hold hands or whether they do not hold them, whether they speak in one or two languages, or whether they prefer monolingualism. So we need to start learning awareness that there are many ways to experience and to appreciate God. And three, that awareness. And three, we have to redefine the idea of what it means to be a worship community. The worship community, of course, we all find our ways. We all journey from different corners of the parish or the diocese, and we all coincide at the time of celebrating Mass or at the time of celebrating a sacrament, the liturgy. But we need to understand that the worshiping community is not limited to the experience of being in the liturgical celebration, but that the liturgical experience actually spills over into our lives, into what happens at home, into what happens at work, into what happens in our, with our neighbors, into what happens in our public commitments. So in many ways, liturgical life and the experience of the spirituality through the liturgy is much bigger than the liturgy. The liturgy pulls us together, shows us the way, yet it doesn't stay there. We all go. And that's the whole meaning of ite missa est, no? Just go and live and continue the worship. When the priest tells us, or the deacon tells us, go in peace, they are not saying everything is over and come back the following day, you know, or come back the following week. What they're saying is keep worshiping, continue this worship that spills into life over and over again. So if we were to begin doing this, then you and I will actually have a better appreciation about the multiple experiences that are associated with the Hispanic Catholic experience to which we're going to turn. So, Catholicism in the United States of America through the lenses of the Hispanic community. Well, if you go to a mass in Spanish, if you go to a mass in English, especially in New England or the Midwest, okay, what are some of the regular characteristics that we see in many of these masses? We see masses that are monolingual, okay? Usually, the preferred instrument is, which one? The organ, so the preferred instrument is the organ. We also tend to see these churches that are beautiful churches, these churches well adorned, beautiful decorations, big spaces, and we also tend to see an emphasis on the rubrics and the rules, So the liturgy in the North American world, so it's very attentive to the sense of beauty, but also to the sense of duty, okay? Beauty and duty. So I know that bishops are very strict with their priests about following the rubrics, and priests are very strict with the liturgical ministers about the practices, how to be a good lector, how to be a good extraordinary minister of the Eucharist, and on and on and on, okay? If you go to a mass in Spanish, there's a lot of that as well. However, there's a unique flexibility that we begin to see, okay? So the emphasis in worship, for the Latino community, then as a matter of fact, it seems to be more focused, not much on the beauty and the aesthetics of the church, but it's more focused on the people, on the community. So people arrive in church at a Hispanic community, what's the first thing that you begin to do? You hug everybody, and you feel welcomed, and you make others feel welcomed. But not only that, in the context of worship in the Hispanic community, we regularly see people practicing popular devotions. Besides the rosary, we introduce the quinceañeras within the liturgy, and people bring their own objects so the priest can bless them. And so we have all these traditions that somehow blur the liturgical with what happens outside. What's the difference? How is it possible that we have the same church in two almost different ways of embracing this? And historically, we can say that it all goes back to around the time of Trent, the Council of Trent. And as you remember, the Council of Trent takes place in the 16th century. Okay, so and the thrust of the Council of Trent was in many ways to respond to what was considered the Protestant Reformation, okay? The Protestant Reformation. So I always speak about the Catholic Revolution, the Protestant Reformation. Okay, so the Protestant community, Protestant leaders introduced major reforms to what eventually led different ways of being church. But Catholics, responded with a major revolution. And the revolution was liturgical, spiritual, missionary, educational, and also expressed in several other ways. So when, in response to the Protestant the reform, or the Protestant reforms, okay, Catholics, for instance, developed in a more strict way the Code of Canon Law. So we developed more laws because we needed order. We created seminaries because in seminaries we actually were going to train priests, so they would know how to lead communities well and better respond to the community. As a matter of fact, the Council of Trent called for a new catechism. And that new catechism was issued and written, not for everybody, but it was written primarily for priests. So priests could preach well. So they could preach well. So, and then in terms of the liturgy, it was important that Catholics understood what the liturgy was about, okay? Because the Protestant Reformation had little by little, taken the sacraments and reduced them to either only the Eucharist, in a particular way, baptism, and in some cases, marriage. But the Catholic tradition said, no, we want to name these 7 sacraments. Trent names them, and then with time, the celebration of those sacraments and the liturgy, becomes overly expressed through rubrics, in response. So the stricter our liturgy is, the better people will know how to celebrate it and how to go by it, okay? So the way the priests dress, the way the movements occur within the liturgy, the words, and so on. So as the years go by, that Catholicism becomes, as going back to the point that I made earlier, the emphasis becomes on uniformity, a lot of uniformity. It becomes centered on the role of the priest, largely on the role of the priest, and it becomes also, a Catholicism, a liturgical life. It becomes a liturgical life that is very attentive to aesthetics, okay? To aesthetics. The use of incense, for instance, the use of the stained windows, for instance, the building of beautiful churches, and on and on. Well, that's the Catholicism that arrived in the United States of America, largely in the 18th and 19th centuries. So this is the Catholicism that arrives in the United States of America is a Catholicism that, had been shaped by the post-Tridentine experience, by the post-Tridentine experience. So that's Catholicism that comes from Europe, settles in the United States of America, and again, shaped by the battle and by the struggles with Protestantism, but at the same time developed, with this hope that a stricter and more regulated and also more aesthetic, and more rigid liturgical life and spiritual life would give way to a better practice. There were movements within Catholicism in Europe, for instance, Romanticism, spiritual Romanticism or Catholic Romanticism in Europe, that would go back to devotional life. They wanted to rescue some of that, but still, the Catholicism that prevails here in the US and some parts of Canada is this post-Tridentine Catholicism, okay? Now, it's fascinating because we inherited much of it. We have inherited, and particularly Euro-American Catholics, inherited this type of Catholicism. In Latin America, some of that Catholicism also arrived. Some of that Catholicism, post-Tridentine Catholicism, arrived. But there was something very interesting. By the time Catholics arrived in the United States of America, almost all indigenous communities had been wiped out, okay? So basically when Catholics arrived in the United States of America, most of the people they find in this country are not Native Americans. And because of the racism and because of slavery and because of they did not mix, these European Catholics did not mix with Black people even those who were also Catholic. So most of their interactions are with white Protestants who were settling or had settled already throughout the United States of America. And if you think about it, we as Roman Catholics have a lot in common with many of the Protestant traditions that developed in the United States of America. For instance, our sense of stewardship, is fabulous, The way many of our churches, many bishops in this country actually built Catholic churches resembling Protestant churches in order to demonstrate that we were truly American, okay? So that was it's just fascinating. Go to Chicago. That's one of the best examples, for instance, where we find this dynamic. In Latin America, there was another dynamic which I find quite, that we need to find interesting. In Latin America, many of the first missionaries that brought Catholicism to this country, they arrived almost 100 years before the Catholicism that was highly influenced by the Council of Trent. So for almost a century, these missionaries and the Catholics who arrived in this country, they came, and who did they find? Not white Protestants from Europe. They found indigenous communities, and there was also strong level of slavery, a lot of slavery in the Americas, But what happened to this? What happened to many of these Catholics? They began to mix, in many ways. Some of them mixed physically, So they had, they started, mating with indigenous groups, with members of the Black community. But the mixing was not only physical or biological, it was also cultural, religious, okay? And in many ways, it was intellectual. So what happened here is that we see what sociologists and historians call mestizaje. So there is a process of religious, cultural mestizaje in which the Catholicism that arrives in Latin America, even though it retains its European identity, it mixes a lot with Catholicism, with the traditions, religious traditions. But not only that, because that Catholicism that arrived in the United States, arrived in Latin America prior to the Council of Trent, it was not overly concerned with rubrics and the liturgy. So it was a Catholicism that was more flexible, and it was based on popular religion, popular devotions, on popular devotions. So this is why many of these people right here, all over Latin America, they did not have churches. The United States of America, just to give you a sense of how obsessed we were with the liturgy, and how we were with the liturgy and the post-Tridentine Catholicism, Catholics in the United States of America, in 150 years, built more than 21,000 churches in one country. More than 21,000 churches in one country. Right here, just to give you a sense, in the entire country of Brazil, there are barely 12,000 parishes, 13,000 parishes. In most of these places, there were hundreds, a few thousands of parishes here and there. Where did all these people, how did all these people worship and celebrate their faith and keep their Catholic identity? It was mostly through popular religion, catechesis done by grandparents and on and on. But it wasn't only through the liturgy. With time, there was also, building of beautiful temples, and Catholicism starts flourishing. But by the time the post-Tridentine Catholicism flourishes in Latin America, which would be 19th and 20th century, by the time that Catholicism starts flourishing, there was already a huge, huge foundation of the more flexible, popular Catholicism-based experience, okay? So now it's like if we had two churches. We had the pre-Tridentine church, eventually layered by a post-Tridentine church with a strong foundation. And then in North America, we'll have the mostly post-Tridentine church, right here. What's been happening then? That in the 20th and 21st centuries, so because of globalization, instead of the North moving and shifting towards the South, as it used to be during the time of colonialism, in the 20th and 21st century, what we see is the other way around. The South is making its way to the North. So just to give you a sense, since the beginning of the 20th century, in the last 120 years, about 30 million Hispanics or Latin Americans have made their home in the United States. 30 million. The vast majority, like me, Roman Catholic, immigrant, Roman Catholic, Spanish speaking. So people like me and like many others in this room, we all have arrived in the United States, from Latin America and the Caribbean with that dual experience. The experience of popular Catholicism that sustains our lives and the experience of the more traditional, liturgical-based, church-based Catholicism, And then we find ourselves moving and making it all the way through Mexico and coming here, And then we start going through all parishes. And what's happening? That we collide in many of our communities. We collide because many of these churches, for instance, one of the biggest battles I remember in my own parish at the beginning, when we began Hispanic ministry in my parish, the Anglo community, they love their organ. I mean, it's just beautiful organ, and we got their choir and so on. But the Latino community, mostly Caribbean, brought their guitars and their, and their congas and their, many other instruments and microphones, and it's just like a big merengue salsa fiesta, So it was just great. So, and then, add to that the quinceañeras and the popular devotions, and add the flexibility of clapping and dancing during Mass and so on. And my friends in the Anglo community would look and say, like, what is this? We have never experienced that, But people here have experienced it. And people have experienced that in other parts of the world. If we were talking today about, for instance, Black Catholicism, what I'm saying is very similar to the African experience and other experiences throughout the world. So I want you to understand that, because if you understand this historical piece, everything that I'm going to say from now on will click right away, okay?